At 0:30 on January 11, 1941, Captain Pat Clayton extinguished the solitary headlamp of his Chevrolet truck. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of a European battlefield, broken by distant artillery or the drone of engines. It was a primeval, pressurized silence, the sound of a 500,000 square mile void known as the Libyan Sand Sea. Clayton and the 30 men of his patrol were more than 480 kilometers, 300 miles, southwest of Cairo, and, more importantly, 400 kilometers behind the nearest Italian front line. They were more isolated than a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Their only companions were the scorpions and the cold night wind. Below them, in a salt depression, lay the faint lights of their target, the Murzik oasis. It was the administrative nerve center of southern Italian Libya, complete with an imposing fort tag, a vital landing strip, and a radio post that connected Tripoli to the heart of Africa. To the Italians, Murzik was one of the safest places on earth. It was protected not by minefields or barbed wire, but by the impassive immensity of the desert. No army could cross it. Clayton's men were not in tanks. They were not in armored cars. They were sitting on the metal seats of 11 Chevrolet 30 CWT, 1.5-ton, trucks. These were common commercial vehicles, indistinguishable from Coca-Cola delivery trucks in Ohio, except for three things: they were overloaded with gasoline cans, painted pale pink, the desert pink, and equipped with fast-firing Vickers K machine guns, cannibalized from obsolete biplanes. They had no armor. The wooden door of Clayton's truck would not stop even a pistol shot. If they were detected, there would be no retreat. There would be no artillery support. There would be no air evacuation. Death would come in two forms: quickly, from the fort's Breda machine guns, or slowly, from thirst, after the Italians inevitably punctured their radiators. Clayton raised his binoculars. The Italian sentries were relaxed, silhouetted against the mess hall lights. He checked his watch. "Start engines," he ordered softly. The 11 six-cylinder Chevrolet engines roared to life with a low, guttural sound. "Patrol, in line," Clayton said over the radio. "Advance." The 11 trucks, weighing over 4 tons each with their fuel and weapons, emerged from the darkness and descended the dune toward the fort. They accelerated. 20 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour. The Vickers and Lewis machine guns swayed on their mounts. The Italians, hearing the noise, ran to their posts, confused. They aimed spotlights, expecting Bedouins, perhaps a few camels. What they saw was a nightmare. A battle line of civilian trucks speeding toward them from nowhere, flames spitting from a dozen heavy machine guns. The sound was like the tearing of a giant canvas. Tracer rounds set the fuel depots ablaze, illuminating the airfield and the 3 Caproni bombers parked there. To the Italians, it was impossible. It was like being attacked by a warship in the middle of the Sahara. The attack was the culmination of a strategic failure that had almost cost the British North Africa. Before this, the Desert War was a stalemate. The Italian army, vastly superior in numbers, and the small British army of the Nile faced each other along a single strip of asphalt on the Mediterranean coast. But the real war was not on the coast. It was on the southern flank, an open flank of 1,500 kilometers of sand, wind, and 120-degree heat. Standard military doctrine on both sides was that this vast area was a dead zone. It was impassable for mechanized armies. Standard armored cars, like the British Rolls-Royce or the Italian Lancia, were too heavy, and their thin tires sank immediately into the soft sand. Tanks overheated and broke down in hours. Infantry could not be supplied. The desert was a barrier, period. The Italians built their entire defensive strategy around this assumption. They built over 50 remote forts and airfields in the interior, in Kufra, Uvainat, Murzik, to control the oases and local tribes, knowing they were perfectly safe. From the air, their air force, the Regia Aeronautica, dominated, spotting any British movement on the coast. The British command in Cairo was blind. They had no intelligence on what was happening in the desert. They couldn't attack the Italian supply lines. They couldn't raid their airfields. The southern flank was a black hole. They were trapped in a war of attrition they couldn't win. But one man, a 44-year-old scientist who wasn't even a real soldier, looked at the sand sea and saw something different. He didn't see a barrier. He saw a highway. In 1940, the British command in Cairo faced a mathematical disaster. General Wavell, the commander-in-chief, was in charge of defending Egypt and the Suez Canal, the vital artery of the British Empire. Against him, in Libya, was Marshal Graziani, leading the Italian 10th Army. The brutal statistics were a nightmare. Graziani had approximately 250,000 soldiers. Wavell had 36,000. A disadvantage of almost 7 to 1. Tanks, the Italians had over 300 M13/40 tanks. The British had fewer than 100 tanks, most of them older, mechanically unreliable, Crusader models. Air, the Italian Regia Aeronautica had overwhelming air superiority, with hundreds of bombers and fighters based on airfields the British couldn't even locate. The war in North Africa was not a war of trench lines. It was a war of logistics. It was a 1,500-mile duel in the desert, fought along a single strip of asphalt, the Via Balbia, the coastal road built by Mussolini. Whoever controlled the logistics, won. And the British were losing. The problem was that the British Army was fighting with the wrong equipment. Their reconnaissance doctrine was based on World War I cavalry, simply updated with engines. The elite reconnaissance units, like the 11th Hussars, used the Rolls-Royce armored car. It was an impressive machine on the asphalt roads of Flanders, but in the desert, it was a disaster. It weighed over 4 tons, its armor made it top-heavy, and, most importantly, it used tall, thin, high-pressure, bicycle-like tires. The pattern of failure was agonizingly predictable. A squadron of Rolls-Royce armored cars receives orders to flank the enemy and find their supply lines. They pull off the coastal road onto the hard ground of the desert. For a few kilometers, it's fine. Then, they hit the first patch of fesh, fine, powdery sand, the consistency of flour. The thin, high-pressure tires sink immediately. The cars bog down to their axles. The crew spends the next 12 hours in the 48 degrees Celsius 118 degrees Fahrenheit sun, using flimsy metal mats to try to dig out, overheating their water-cooled engines, and exhausting their precious drinking water supply. If they are lucky, they turn around and return to base, defeated. If they are spotted by the Italian Air Force, they are destroyed. The brutal statistic was this: the maximum effective penetration of a standard British armored patrol into the desert was about 30 to 50 kilometers from the coast. Meanwhile, the vital Italian supply lines, which ran from the port of Tripoli south, to oases like Merzuk, and then east to the front line, were 150 to 400 kilometers inland. They were in a sanctuary. The British command in Cairo was tactically blind. The Regia Aeronautica, flying from secret inland airfields, could see every move the British made on the coastal road. But the British had no idea where the Italians were resupplying. Where was the fuel coming from? Where were the ammunition dumps? How many troops were being moved through the southern flank? The intelligence was zero. The map of southern Libya in Wavell's headquarters was, literally, a blank space. The official solutions were worse than useless. High Command kept sending more of the same, more Matilda heavy tanks, which sank in the sand, more Humber armored cars, which had the same thin, useless tires. They were trying to apply European warfare doctrine, heavy armor, big guns, to an environment that was more like the ocean than land. They were fighting a one-dimensional war on a single road, while the enemy owned 99% of the battlefield, the vast desert to the south, unchallenged. What the British needed was not a better tank. They needed a navigator. They needed someone who didn't see the desert as a wall, but as a back door. The man who looked at the blank desert map and saw a highway was not a cavalry general or a tank strategist. He was a 44-year-old, quiet, academic, and soft-spoken man named Major Ralph Bagnald. In 1940, he wasn't even a full-time soldier, he was a reserve officer in the Royal Corps of Signals, a scientist first, who had been called back to service. And he had a secret qualification that made him the only person on the planet capable of solving the Libyan impasse. He was the world's foremost expert on the physics of sand. Born in 1896 into a family of military men and explorers, Bagnall followed the expected path. He joined the Royal Engineers, served with distinction in the trenches of World War I, where he was decorated for bravery, and remained in the army. But his heart was not that of a soldier, it was that of a scientist. He was obsessed with how the physical world worked. His secret qualification was born from a bureaucratic stroke of luck. In 1926, as a young officer, he was assigned to a dead-end post in Cairo, Egypt. For most officers of the empire, this meant a dull routine of dinner parties, polo, and base management. For Bagnall, it was like sending a botanist to the Amazon. He was surrounded by the largest physics laboratory in the world, the Western Desert. On weekends, he and a few other board officers, like Pat Clayton, his future patrol commander, began to do what wealthy Britons did. They took their civilian cars, in this case, flimsy Ford Model Ts, and went dune bashing. They failed in exactly the same way as the Rolls-Royce armored car units. They would leave the road, their thin, high-pressure tires would hit the soft sand, and within minutes, they were bogged down to the axles under a 45 degrees Celsius 113 degrees Fahrenheit sun. But this is where Bagnall was different. The average soldier cursed the sand. Bagnall studied it. He didn't see an annoyance, he saw an engineering problem that needed a solution. Why was the car sinking? The answer, he theorized, wasn't about horsepower. It was about ground pressure. A standard military tire, like that on an armored car, was designed to be tough. This meant it was narrow and inflated to a very high pressure, over 60 psi, to prevent punctures on gravel roads. But on sand, this design was fatal. The high pressure made the tire hard as a rock, and its narrow contact patch focused the entire weight of the vehicle onto a few square inches. The tire didn't roll over the sand, it dug into it, like a circular saw. Bagnall's counterintuitive solution was the opposite. He found that if he took the wide, fragile tires of a civilian Chevrolet truck and let the air out, lowering the pressure to 15 to 20 psi, the tire flattened out like a camel's foot. This spread the 4-ton weight of the truck over a much larger surface area. The truck now floated on the surface of the sand instead of digging in. Where the high-tech, high-pressure armored car sank in seconds, the low-tech, low-pressure Chevy truck glided over it with ease. This was the first crucial innovation: soft tires beat sand, not hard tires. Next came the water problem. A water-cooled engine in 48 degrees Celsius 118 degrees Fahrenheit heat boils constantly. On his first trips, Bagnall found that 30% of his precious drinking water supply was being used just to top off the radiator. This limited the range of any patrol to a day out and back, the same 50-kilometer problem the army had. Bagnall's solution was a work of hacker genius. He noticed the steam hissing from the radiator's overflow pipe. This was water being wasted. He took a copper tube, attached it to the overflow, and ran it into a 1-gallon, about 4-liter, can mounted on the fender. The hot steam entered the can, cooled against the metal, and condensed back into water. At the end of a day's driving, the can contained a quart or two of distilled water, which they simply poured back into the radiator. He called it the radiator condenser. With this 5-shilling invention, he had just made engine water resupply obsolete. His truck's range went from 100 kilometers to 1,000. Finally, there was the problem of navigation. The desert is a featureless ocean. A 1-degree navigation error means you miss your fuel dump by 20 kilometers. In a place where magnetic compasses went haywire from the metal of the trucks and iron or rocks, this was a death sentence. Bagnall, the scientist, used an older principle. He invented the Bagnall sun compass. It was a simple brass device, looking like a sundial, that used the sun's shadow and a set of charts to provide a perfectly accurate, non-magnetic, foolproof bearing. From 1927 to 1935, Bagnall and his small team of civilian explorers, Pat Clayton, Bill Kennedy Shaw, used their modified Fords and Chevrolets to do what the world thought impossible. They were the first Europeans to cross the impassable Libyan Sand Sea. They mapped the blank space that was now paralyzing General Wavell. In 1939, as war broke out, Bagnall was on a ship home, his army career over, having just written the definitive book on his hobby, the physics of blown sand in desert dunes. When the British Army found itself trapped on the coast, defeated by sand, Bagnall realized he wasn't just a retired scientist. He was the only man alive who knew how to turn Wavell's greatest weakness into his greatest weapon. Ralph Bagnall's click was not a moment of new invention. It was a moment of crushing application. In 1939, this 44-year-old reserve major, who had spent the last 4 years of his civilian life scientifically studying geology, arrived in Cairo for what was supposed to be a dull desk job in the Signals Corps. What he found was panic. He watched, with a mixture of professional horror and scientific fascination, as the British Army, the greatest mechanized force in the world, banged its head against the same problem that he and his friends had solved a decade earlier with civilian cars bought from scrap yards. He saw the patrol reports from the 11th Hussars. He saw the mechanical failure statistics. He saw the Rolls-Royce armored cars, with their high-pressure tires, being towed back from the desert's edge, their engines boiled dry and their axles broken. The generals at Middle East HQ were trying to solve the problem with more of the same, more armor, more guns, more horsepower. They were trying to force a European solution onto an African environment. And Bagnall, the only man in Cairo who had an actual map of the Great Sand Sea hanging on his wall, a map he had drawn, realized the solution wasn't new technology. The solution was his old one. The scene of inspiration was a daring proposal. Using his minor rank as a major and his pre-war scientific reputation, he secured a meeting with the Commander-in-Chief, General Archibald Wavell. Wavell was a rare leader, intellectual, well-read, and, crucially, deeply bored by military orthodoxy. Bagnall, with his hand-drawn maps and meticulously logged fuel consumption data from 1932, made his pitch. It was the perfect counterintuitive theory. Sir, he would have argued, High Command considers the southern desert a barrier. The Italians do too. You are both wrong. The desert is not a barrier. It is an ocean. And like any ocean, it has tides, weather, and hazards. But, like an ocean, it can be navigated, if you have the right ship. Bagnall's solution was not a new, million-pound tank. It was a 500-pound commercial truck. The engineering of the solution, the desert ship. This is the technical dive. The organization's complex, failing solution was the armored car. It was heavy, designed to stop bullets, had a complex water-cooled engine, and used narrow, high-pressure tires. Bagnall's simple, elegant solution was the Chevrolet WA30CWT 1.5-ton truck. And here is why. The physics of flotation, the core problem was ground pressure. The Rolls-Royce armored car weighed 4.5 tons, but its narrow, hard tires, inflated to 60 psi, focused all that weight on a few square inches. It dug into the sand. The Chevrolet 30CWT was a lightweight commercial vehicle. Bagnall stripped off everything unnecessary, doors, windscreens, cab roofs, fenders, to reduce weight. Then, he used his greatest discovery, the tires. He fitted the Chevys with wide, soft, low-pressure tires, like the 9.00x 16-inch Dunlop track grip, and deflated them to 15 to 20 psi. The tire flattened out, spreading the truck's 4-ton, now overloaded, weight over a 300% larger surface area. Result, the Rolls-Royce dug. The Chevrolet floated. The physics of water, the condenser. This was the hack of genius that made long range possible. A water-cooled engine in 48 degrees Celsius 118 degrees Fahrenheit heat boils constantly. In tests, a standard military truck lost up to 4 gallons, 15 liters, of water per day just to radiator evaporation and overflow. On a 10-truck patrol, that meant 40 gallons, 150 liters, a day, the equivalent of 20 men's drinking water supply. Range was being dictated by the engine's thirst. Solution: Bagnall welded a nozzle onto the radiator's overflow pipe. He attached a simple copper tube that ran from the nozzle to a 4-gallon, a gasoline, flimsy, can mounted on the front of the truck. Instead of the steam escaping into the air, it was forced into the empty can. The cooler metal of the can, sometimes with a wet burlap sack wrapped around it, condensed the steam back into pure, distilled water. At the end of the day, the crew simply unscrewed the can and poured the reclaimed water back into the radiator. Result: radiator water loss, 0. The range of Bagnall's desert ship became limited only by fuel, not water. The physics of navigation: the sundial. The desert is an ocean of sand without landmarks. Dead reckoning, navigation was suicidal. More importantly, a standard magnetic compass was nearly useless. The 4-ton engine and metal mass of the truck distorted the magnetic field. And in many parts of the desert, iron or rocks in the ground made the compass needle spin uselessly. Solution: the Bagnall Sun Compass. The brass device he had invented in the 1930s. It was essentially a high-tech, reverse sundial. Mounted on the dashboard, the navigator used a pointer, a gnomon, to cast a shadow on a dial. By aligning the shadow with the desired bearing, consulting astronomical charts, it gave a perfectly accurate bearing, based on the unchanging position of the sun. It was foolproof, non-magnetic, and allowed patrols to navigate 1,000 kilometers and find a 10-meter-wide fuel dump buried in the sand. The prototype Bagnall proposed to Wavell wasn't a truck, it was a unit. He called it the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG. And he wouldn't man it with career British soldiers, whom he found too rigid. He asked to recruit from the 2nd New Zealand Division. These were farmers, sheep shearers, and mechanics from rural areas. They were men who knew how to fix an engine with barbed wire and didn't need an officer to tell them what to do. Wavell, seeing the flawless logic of Bagnall's engineering, greenlit him. He gave Bagnall 6 weeks to turn his scientific theory and truck driving hobby into a functioning military unit. General Wavell's green light in June 1940 was not an end, it was the beginning of Ralph Bagnall's real battle. His innovation was not just a breach of a minor procedure. It was a frontal assault on the entire mechanized warfare doctrine of the British Army, and the bureaucracy that protected it now rose up like a wall. The regulations and the bureaucracy. Bagnall was violating nearly a century of military tradition and the Sacred King's regulations. The first and most glaring violation was that of standard-issue equipment. The British Army, especially the Quartermaster Corps, ran on a rigid supply chain. They issued standard military vehicles, Bedford trucks, Humber armored cars, Matilda tanks. These were robust, tested vehicles, and most importantly, they had an established supply line of spare parts. Bagnall went to the Quartermaster HQ and said, in effect, your standard-issue military equipment is useless. I would like to purchase a fleet of civilian Chevrolet WA trucks, because they are better. To the establishment, this was logistical heresy. A quartermaster brigadier would have replied, Major, that is impossible. We do not stock spare parts for 6-cylinder Chevrolet engines. We do not have the correct sized tires. If one of your civilian trucks breaks an axle 300 miles into the desert, what do you expect us to do? Send a tow truck? Your unit will not last a week. The second rebellion was against the Royal Armoured Corps. The doctrine of deep reconnaissance and raiding belonged to them. It was the job of their cavalry regiments, like the 11th Hussars. And their doctrine was unequivocal, armor saves lives. Bagnall was proposing the exact opposite. He argued that armor was a liability. Armor added weight. Weight required high-pressure tires. And high-pressure tires made the vehicle sink in the sand. His innovation wasn't just the Chevy, it was the rejection of armor itself. A cavalry colonel, with polished leather boots and a lifetime of tank experience, would have looked at Bagnall with contempt. Major, with all due respect, what you are proposing is murder. You are sending men behind enemy lines in wooden trucks. No armor. No protection. A single Italian Ghibli fighter or an enemy reconnaissance patrol will massacre them. They will be killed by light machine gun fire. It is tactically insane. The official, no, and the consequences. The official, no, came from every technical department. The Mechanical Engineers Corps, REM, objected to the unauthorized modifications. The Quartermaster Corps objected to the logistics. The Armored Corps objected to the doctrine. Bagnall, a 44-year-old major from the Signals Corps, a technical, non-combat branch, was telling every combat arm that they were wrong. The personal risk was total. If his theory failed, the result would not be a harsh note in his file. It would be the deaths, and the horrific deaths, of dozens of men. Imagine the failure scenario. Pat Clayton's T Patrol, 30 men strong, sets off for the Merzuk raid. They navigate 400 kilometers into the Great Sand Sea. Then, Bagnall's hack fails. The homemade radiator condenser fails, and the engines begin to boil over. Or, worse, his theory on low-pressure tires was wrong, correct for a 1927 Ford T, but disastrous for a 4-ton Chevy, overloaded with gasoline, water, and ammunition. The tires blow out under the heat and load. The patrol is stranded, 300 kilometers from the nearest friendly outpost. There is no radio with enough range to call for help. There is no possibility of rescue. The Italians don't find them. They simply die of thirst, one man at a time, next to their useless civilian trucks. The consequences for Bagnall would be absolute. He would be court-martialed. The press in London, always looking for a scapegoat for the desert losses, would crucify him. Mad scientist sends 30 New Zealand heroes to their deaths in desert. His scientific reputation, built over a lifetime, would be destroyed. He would be remembered not as the author of the physics of blown sand, but as an arrogant academic who got men killed with his hubris. The decision and the accomplice. Bagnall faced this wall of skepticism with the only thing he had, data. He wasn't guessing. He knew the physics was correct. He wasn't proposing a theory, he was reporting a decade of field experience. His decision to proceed was not a leap of faith, it was an act of scientific certainty. The army was wrong. Its regulations were wrong. Its doctrine was wrong. And he could prove it. But scientific certainty doesn't win bureaucratic battles. He needed an accomplice. And he found the perfect one, General Archibald Wavell. Wavell, the commander-in-chief, was the accomplice who made the rebellion possible. Wavell was an intellectual, a reader of poetry, and a man who despised rigid military doctrine. He saw the stalemate in the desert and knew his cavalry commanders didn't have the answer. When Bagnall presented him with his logic, the desert is an ocean, and I have built the right ship, Wavell didn't see a signals major breaking the rules. He saw a genius offering him the only solution that made sense. Wavell risked his own career. He used his authority as commander-in-chief to smash the bureaucracy. He personally signed the requisitions. When the Quartermaster Corps said, "We can't supply Chevrolets," Wavell replied, "Then buy them." When the Armored Corps said, "It's suicidal," Wavell replied, "It's essential." Most crucially, Wavell gave Bagnall his most precious resource, men. Bagnall wanted the best. He asked to recruit from the 2nd New Zealand Division. Their commander, General Bernard Freyberg, protested vehemently. He was not about to turn over his best farmers and mechanics to some mad scientist for a suicide mission. Wavell stepped in and ordered Freyberg to provide the volunteers. Bagnall now had his political shield. Wavell was taking all the career risk. He had given Bagnall cover, men, trucks, and 6 weeks. Now, the middle-aged scientist and his crew of Kiwi farmers had to drive 400 kilometers through hell and prove the entire British war machine wrong. The surgery that transformed Ralph Bagnall's scientific theory into a weapon of war did not take place in a sterile lab. It took place in a dusty, scorching hot courtyard on the outskirts of Cairo, at the Abbasiyah Barracks, during the suffocating summer of 1940. Here, the newly formed Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, set up its base. They were an orphan unit, a logistical aberration, surrounded by regular British Army regiments who viewed them with a mix of contempt and amused curiosity. The nearby cavalry HQs and tank regiments sported real, warfighting equipment, Matilda tanks, Humber armored cars, military specification Bedford trucks. Bagnall's courtyard, in contrast, looked like a fifth-rate workshop. It was filled with commercial Chevrolet WA-30 CWT trucks, freshly purchased from a civilian dealership in Cairo, still in their factory finish. The surgery was the process of hacking these civilian vehicles, turning them into desert ships. The team was not from the Royal Mechanical Engineers Corps, REM, those were men who followed manuals. Bagnall's team was his New Zealanders. They were sheep farmers, tractor mechanics, and rural laborers. They were men who had spent their lives improvising, fixing broken machinery 100 miles from the nearest town with nothing but wire and ingenuity. They were, by nature, hackers. The scene at Abbasia Barracks was a pandemonium of unauthorized modification. The sound of metal saws echoed across the courtyard as the New Zealanders methodically cut away everything that added weight and was not essential. The bodywork, the heavy metal doors? Gone. The glass windscreens, which reflected the sun and shattered? Gone, replaced by small canvas screens. The cab roofs, which trapped the heat like an oven? Ripped off with cutting torches, leaving the cab open to the elements. The radiator, hack, this was the most critical surgery. Regular army mechanics watched in disbelief as the LRDG men took a copper pipe, crudely soldered it to the Chevy's radiator overflow spout, and ran it into a clean, empty, 4-gallon gasoline, flimsy, can that was bolted to the front bumper. "What in blazes is that?" an REM officer asked. "That's our ticket home," a New Zealand sergeant replied. This radiator condenser looked like something from a scrap heap, but it was the innovation that would make water resupply obsolete. Weapons and mounts, the civilian trucks had no way to mount weapons. The Kiwis fabricated their own. They welded heavy steel plates to the truck beds and created pintle mounts for the Vickers K aviation machine guns and the air-cooled Lewis machine guns. At the front, they mounted posts for boys' anti-tank rifles, creating a hedgehog of firepower. Navigation, inside the cab, they tore out the useless mirrors and ashtrays. In their place, in the center of the dashboard, they bolted the sacred brass device, the Bagnall Sun Compass. While the surgery was underway, the strain of the weight fell entirely on Ralph Bagnall. He was a 44-year-old scientist who suddenly had 150 lives under his responsibility. He wasn't training men to march, he was training them to survive an environment that would kill an untrained man in 48 hours. His greatest anxiety was not the enemy, it was his own mathematics. He spent his nights in his office, not planning battle tactics, but reviewing his expedition journals from 1932. His notes became the unit's Bible. Fuel consumption, 6 miles per gallon, mpg, on hard terrain, 3 miles per gallon in soft sand. Water consumption, 1 gallon per man, per day, for drinking, cooking, and washing. Average speed, 15 miles per hour, if all went well. These were not academic numbers. They were the equation of life and death. If he miscalculated the fuel consumption by 10%, an entire patrol would die of thirst 80 kilometers from their resupply dump. The staff officers at Middle East headquarters, comfortable in their Cairo offices, still referred to the LRDG as Bagnall's Desert Yacht Club or Private Army of Hobos. They were waiting for him to fail, so their heavy tank doctrine could be vindicated. Bagnall felt the weight of that skepticism. The imminent risk was perfectly encapsulated in the preparation for the first long-range mission, the raid on Merzuk, as seen in The Hook. Pat Clayton, Bagnall's oldest friend, would lead T Patrol. The clandestine surgery was complete. Now came the loading. The Chevrolet 30 CWT trucks had an official load capacity of 1.5 tons. Clayton's team began to load them. Fuel, over 74-gallon, flimsy, cans of gasoline. The flimsies were tin cans so thin they often arrived from the factory already leaking. A leak meant the loss of their lifeline. A spark meant incineration. Water, 30 flimsy cans of drinking water. As valuable as fuel. Ammunition, thousands of rounds for the Vickers, Lewis, and Boys rifles. Food, crates of bully beef, canned meat, and hardtack biscuits. Spare parts, extra suspension springs, axles, tires. When they finished, each 1.5-ton truck weighed over 4.5 tons. They were suicidally overloaded. The rear suspension springs, which should have been arched, were flattened, groaning under the strain. The center of gravity was dangerously high. A truck would capsize if it took a turn too sharply. Bagnall made his final inspection the night before departure. He walked the line of trucks, smelling the air thick with leaking gasoline and hot engine oil. He saw the calm faces of the New Zealanders, checking their tires and cleaning their weapons. And he saw his old friend, Pat Clayton, checking his son navigation charts one last time. The risk was this: Clayton was about to lead 30 men on a 3,200-kilometer round trip, navigating a featureless sand ocean, to attack a target the British Army didn't even know existed. They would do this in overloaded civilian trucks, modified with junkyard parts, based on a scientist's theory. If a single suspension spring broke irreparably, if Clayton's navigation was off by a single degree, if Bagnall's math on fuel consumption was wrong by 5%, there would be no rescue. There would be no radio call. They would disappear from the face of the earth. It was 0:31 on January 11, 1941. The silence over Merzuk was broken not by a shot, but by the simultaneous roar of 11 six-cylinder Chevrolet engines, accelerating in unison. For the 30 men of the LRDG's patrol, this was the moment Ralph Bagnall's scientific theory met the brutal reality of war. The smell of low-grade gasoline and the heat from the engines filled the cold night air. Pat Clayton, a veteran explorer who knew this desert better than any man alive, shouted into the radio, "Patrol, advance. Line abreast formation, target is the fort and airfield. Fire at will when in range." The 11 4.5-ton, suicidally overloaded trucks moved forward like a bizarre cavalry squadron. The sound of the wide, low-pressure tires crushing the desert gravel was like an avalanche. Inside the Italian fort tag, confusion gave way to panic. The sentries, expecting a handful of tribal rebels on camels, saw a battle line of nearly 3-meter-high truck silhouettes speeding toward them, emerging from the impenetrable darkness they considered their greatest wall. The fort's searchlights snapped on, cutting through the dark, and illuminated the 11 New Zealand desert ships. "Hit them now," yelled a Kiwi sergeant. At 500 meters, the LRDG opened fire. The sound was unlike any battle fought in the desert. It was not the methodical thump of artillery or the pop of rifles. It was the sound of repurposed World War I aviation equipment, and it was terrifying. The air exploded with the sharp, deafening sound of the Vickers K machine guns. These were not infantry weapons, they were aircraft weapons, designed for biplanes, and they fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was not a rat-tat-tat, but a continuous brrrraapppp, like the tearing of a giant canvas. The recoil from these guns shook the entire chassis of the Chevrolet trucks, making them vibrate violently. Mixed with this was the slower, more methodical thump-thump-thump of the air-cooled Lewis guns and the deep, sharp crack of the boys' anti-tank rifles, whose .55 caliber rounds punched through the fort's mud brick walls as if they were cardboard. For the Kiwi gunners, perched on the open beds, it was a sensory hell. The muzzle flash from their own guns was the only light, illuminating the strained faces of their comrades in strobing flashes. The smell of burning cordite was so thick it made them choke. They could hear the pings and whacks of the responding Italian Breda machine guns, the bullets striking the sides of the trucks. And here was the test of Bagnall's counterintuitive theory. The men heard the bullets tearing through the thin wood of the doors and the metal, flimsy, gasoline cans, and they felt completely naked. If they were in a Humber armored car, they would be safe. But if they were in a Humber, they would be bogged down in the sand 300 kilometers away. The lack of armor was the price of admission. The inversion was immediate. The Italians, protected by their impregnable fortress, were being decimated by delivery trucks. The New Zealand gunners, using tracer ammunition, concentrated their fire. Their first salvo hit the most critical target, the 3 Caproni bombers parked on the airfield. The bullets ignited the aviation fuel tanks. In seconds, the first bomber exploded, turning into an orange fireball that illuminated the entire scene. The second target was the fuel depot. A stream of tracers from the Vickers K guns hit the 50-gallon drums. The secondary explosion was colossal. A column of white flame shot 100 meters into the air, silhouetting the panicked fort and raining burning debris down on its own defenders. The raid became a self-illuminating light show. To the fort! Suppress the towers! Clayton yelled. The trucks split, circling the fort like wolves attacking a musk ox. They poured fire into every window and machine gun position, their heavy rounds turning sentry posts into brick dust. The attack lasted for 20 minutes of absolute chaos. Patrol, cease fire. Withdraw. Withdraw to the west rendezvous point. As suddenly as it began, it was over. The 11 trucks turned their backs on the burning hell they had created and sped back into the dark embrace of the desert, leaving behind a ruined fort, a destroyed airfield, and an Italian garrison in a state of absolute shock. The return and the true climax. The raid was a success. But now came the real test. The raid on Murzuk proved the Chevys could fight. The 480-kilometer return journey would prove if Bagnall's math was correct. They drove all night and all the next day, the sun beating down mercilessly. Navigation was everything. Pat Clayton did not take his eyes off his Bagnall's sun compass, the brass sundial that was their only link to safety. Then, on the second day, disaster struck. A lookout on one of the trucks reported a hissing sound. The driver checked the temperature gauge and cursed. A stray Breda bullet, a single lucky shot in the darkness, had punctured the radiator. A thread of steam was hissing from the engine block. In a standard military truck, this would be a death sentence. The loss of radiator water would mean a seized engine in 30 minutes. The crew would have to be abandoned to die. But this was an LRDG desert ship. Clayton ordered the patrol to halt. The driver, a sheep farmer from Hawke's Bay, did not panic. He grabbed a piece of chewing gum, chewed it soft, and used it to plug the bullet hole. But the lost water had to be replaced. Here was the vivid debrief of Bagnall's innovation. The patrol did not need to use their precious, rationed canteens of drinking water. The sergeant went to each of the other 10 trucks, unscrewed the 4-gallon can mounted on the bumper, the homemade radiator condenser, and poured out the perfectly distilled water it had collected on the trip to Murzuk. In 10 minutes, the damaged truck's radiator was full. Bagnall's 5-shilling hack was not just a tool of efficiency, it was a redundant life support system. The system saved the lives of that crew. 2 days later, Clayton's patrol, exhausted, covered in soot, and half-deaf, rolled into their forward oasis at Kufra. They weren't smiling. They were alive, which was more surprising. Clayton sent his radio message to Cairo. The payoff of the story arrived at Wavell's headquarters. The skeptics in the Armored Corps and the Quartermaster Corps read the report with disbelief. Bagnall and his crew of farmers had not just driven 3,200 kilometers in civilian trucks. They had penetrated 400 kilometers into impassable enemy territory and destroyed a strategic airbase. The Desert Yacht Club had just proven that the entire strategic map of North Africa was wrong. Pat Clayton's report on the Murzuk raid landed on General Wavell's desk in Cairo like a stone in a pond. The ripples were not just of congratulations, they were of immediate strategic reassessment. Ralph Bagnall's Desert Yacht Club had just delivered the impossible. They had navigated an unnavigable ocean and set an enemy port on fire. The mass adoption that followed was not the British Army creating 50 more LRDG units. The LRDG was too specialized for that, its men were inimitable. Instead, the adoption was of the LRDG's service. Overnight, Bagnall's clandestine unit of scientists and farmers became the most sought-after asset in all of North Africa. The demand didn't come from the bottom up, it came from every corner of the intelligence and special operations community, which suddenly saw the desert not as a wall, but as a back door that Bagnall had just kicked open for them. The first demand, pure intelligence, the road watch. The first and most important customer was General Wavell himself. The Murzuk raid was spectacular, but Wavell was a strategist. He realized the true power of Bagnall's innovation wasn't destroying an occasional fort. It was the ability to get there. If Clayton could drive to Murzuk, he could drive anywhere. Wavell was blind. His air force was losing the reconnaissance battle. The Italian Regia Aeronautica and, soon, Rommel's Luftwaffe, operated from airfields on the coast. What Wavell needed to know was simple: what was coming to them? How many tanks? How much fuel? How many men? The answer became the LRDG's defining and most important mission, the Road Watch. The logistical challenge was immense, far greater than the Merzig raid. Bagnall and his navigators, like Clayton, plotted routes that took their Chevrolet patrols on an 800-kilometer journey, bypassing vast dune seas and Italian outposts, until they reached their destination, the Via Balbia, the single paved supply road running from Tripoli to the front line. The implementation was an act of insane courage. The Chevrolet patrol, about 4 to 5 trucks, would establish a hidden lager camp in a wadi, dry riverbed, 10 to 15 kilometers from the road, perfectly camouflaged against air reconnaissance. A two-man team, an observer and a radio operator, would then crawl the 15 kilometers in the dark, carrying radio equipment, batteries, a week's worth of food, and water canteens. They would dig a hole less than a meter deep, perhaps 500 meters from the road, cover it with a camouflage net draped in sand and scrub, and disappear. For the next 7 to 10 days, these two men lived in that hole. They took turns, 24 hours a day, with a pair of binoculars and a notepad. And they counted. They counted everything. 9:14, convoy of 12 Opel Blitz trucks, Luftwaffe license plate, heading east. Carrying fuel barrels. 9:22, 3 Panzer IV F2 tanks, long 75mm gun, on tank transporters. Heading east. 9:30, Mercedes staff car, with divisional general's flag. Heading west. At dusk, the radio operator would set up his aerial and, using a low-power, but high-frequency, transmitter, send this shopping list of destruction directly to Wavell's headquarters in Cairo. The army bureaucracy didn't have to give in, it was simply bypassed. The information didn't go through battalion, division, or corps. It went directly from the enemy's front line to the commander-in-chief's desk. The result was the purest, most real-time strategic intelligence of the war. The blank map was now being filled in, not by reconnaissance planes that could be deceived, but by men on the ground reading the license plate numbers. The second demand, the desert taxi service, the birth of the SAS. The second demand came from another rebel. A young Scottish lieutenant named David Stirling had an equally mad idea, to create small teams of paratroopers, the Special Air Service, or SAS, to be dropped near Rommel's airfields and destroy them. His first attempt was an utter disaster. Dropped in a desert storm, most of the men were killed or captured. Stirling's innovation had a fatal flaw: parachute insertion was inaccurate, and extraction was impossible. Then Stirling heard about Bagnall. He went to the LRDG and made a proposal. His innovation was destruction. Bagnall's innovation was navigation. Together, they could be unstoppable. The LRDG became the clandestine, desert taxi service for the SAS. The implementation was a symphony of risk. An LRDG patrol, with its overloaded Chevrolets, would pick up 4 to 6 of Stirling's SAS troopers in the middle of nowhere. The LRDG navigators, using their sun compass and their expertise in floating on the sand, would drive the SAS team 400 kilometers through enemy territory. They would drop the raiding party 5 kilometers from the target Luftwaffe airfield. While Stirling and his men crept in to place explosives on Messerschmitt and Stuka bombers, the LRDG patrol would pull back to a prearranged rendezvous point, hide, and wait. This was the most dangerous part. They were an unarmored getaway unit waiting for a hornet's nest to be kicked. Hours later, the SAS, having created hell, would sprint to the rendezvous, leap onto the trucks, and the Chevrolets would accelerate back into the safety of the deep desert, leaving the Germans and Italians staring furiously into a void they still believed was impassable. Bagnall's innovation, the low-pressure Chevy and the radiator condenser, became the platform that allowed Britain's entire Special Operations Force in the desert to exist. Bagnall's 5-shilling hack was now destroying millions of pounds worth of Luftwaffe equipment, hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. The payoff of Ralph Bagnall's scientific theory was so absolute that it rewrote the strategic map of North Africa. The before and after of his innovation are not measured in small tactical gains, they are measured in the difference between total blindness and omniscience, between strategic impotence and surgical destruction. The before, June 1940. British intelligence, 0. The desert map was a blank space. Wavell's HQ in Cairo had no idea where the 50 Italian inland bases were. More importantly, they had no way of knowing what was moving along the Via Balbia, 400 kilometers away. British strategic impact, nil. The Italian supply lines and inland airfields operated in a perfect sanctuary, protected by an ocean of sand that no Allied military vehicle could cross. After January 1941 to October 1942, the LRDG changes the equation. The results came in two distinct forms: the Road Watch, which gave the British eyes, and the SAS taxi service, which gave them a dagger. Result 1, the Road Watch, the intelligence payoff. The LRDG's most brutally effective statistic was not the number of enemies they killed, but the number of trucks they counted. After the Merzak raid, the LRDG's main mission became the Road Watch. Their Chevrolet patrols would navigate 800 kilometers, bypass enemy outposts, and hide two-man teams in holes 500 meters from the Via Balbia. The result was that Wavell's blank map turned into the most detailed, real-time intelligence document of the war. Cairo HQ stopped guessing. They now knew. They knew when a new panzer battalion arrived from Tripoli. They knew the license plate numbers of the Luftwaffe's fuel tanker units. They knew when a German general was moving to the front, allowing the RAF to plan a reception. The turning point, Rommel's mind. The true turning point was the Second Battle of El Alamein, October 1942. General Montgomery, the new commander of the 8th Army, had a secret weapon that Rommel could not comprehend. He knew exactly what the Desert Fox's supply status was. As Rommel planned his offensive, LRDG, Road Watch, patrols were sitting 400 kilometers behind his lines, counting every single fuel truck and tank transporter heading east. This information was radioed to Cairo, where intelligence analysts could calculate Rommel's fuel consumption almost to the gallon. The enemy's reaction was one of absolute disbelief. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of the greatest tactical geniuses in history, was being outmaneuvered not by another general, but by two New Zealanders in a hole. He could not figure out how the British anticipated his every move, how their air force knew exactly where to bomb his secret fuel dumps. In his diary, Rommel complained bitterly of unbelievably accurate enemy intelligence sources, blaming traitors in his own headquarters. Bagnall's innovation, the low-pressure tire and the radiator condenser, had become a strategic intelligence weapon that was breaking the logistical spine of the Afrika Korps. Result 2, the SAS taxi service, the destruction payoff. The user's title, 50 bases destroyed, perfectly captures the second measurable result. The LRDG became the force multiplier for David Stirling's new SAS unit. Bagnall's Chevys were the ships that carried Stirling's Vikings. The before and after stats are staggering. Before, zero-axis aircraft destroyed on the ground. Their airfields were sanctuaries. After, the LRDG-SAS partnership unleashed hell. In one series of coordinated raids in July 1942, SAS teams, delivered and extracted by LRDG's Chevy taxis, destroyed over 100 Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica aircraft on the ground. In a single night, Bagnall's innovation allowed a handful of men to inflict more damage on Rommel's air force than an entire month of air-to-air combat. In total, over the campaign, this LRDG-SAS partnership destroyed over 500 enemy aircraft, mostly vital bombers and transport planes. Dozens of fuel depots, blowing up millions of gallons of gasoline that Rommel desperately needed. Dozens of radio posts, railway lines, and supply convoys. The common Chevrolet truck had not failed. It had succeeded so spectacularly that it proved the entire military doctrine of heavy, armored vehicles was wrong. The failure thesis did not apply to the LRDG, it applied to the establishment that had ridiculed them. Bagnall's Desert Yacht Club, using civilian vehicles and garage science, had become the eyes, ears, and strategic dagger of the entire British Army. The destruction of Fort Merzuk and the subsequent crippling of Rommel's Afrika Korps were not the end of Ralph Bagnold's story, they were the proof of concept. What followed was the lasting legacy of an innovation that not only changed the war but created the very template for all modern special operations. The fate of the protagonist, the scientist's triumph. Ralph Bagnold, the 44-year-old academic who used his passion for physics to break military rules, was utterly vindicated. His Desert Yacht Club, ridiculed in 1940, became the most critical elite unit in the theater. By 1941, he was promoted to colonel to command his expanding creation. But Bagnold was never, at heart, a soldier. He was a scientist who had an engineering problem to solve. Having solved it with undeniable elegance, he turned over field command of the LRDG to others, like Guy Prendergast, and took staff positions, where he could apply his ruthless logic to larger problems of logistics and deception across the Middle East. His recognition was swift and significant. In 1944, he was knighted, Sir Ralph Bagnold. But the award that perhaps meant more to him was not military. In 1944, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, FRS, one of the highest scientific honors in the world. It was the ultimate acknowledgement that his theory was correct. His life's work on the physics of blown sand and desert dunes was not just an academic hobby, it was fundamental science, and that science had a devastatingly effective military application. After the war, Bagnold hung up his uniform for good. He returned to his true calling. He turned down prestigious military posts and instead devoted himself to geology and fluid mechanics. He founded the research laboratory for Royal Dutch Shell and continued his research on the movement of sand and sediment. The oil companies now exploring the desert, using the maps he drew, paid him as a consultant to teach them the physics of their environment. Sir Ralph Bagnold died in 1990, at the age of 94. He is remembered not as a great general, but as something far rarer, a warrior scientist who proved that understanding the environment is a more powerful weapon than any tank. His book, The Physics of Blown Sand, remains the foundational text on the subject to this day. The fate of the innovation, the DNA of Special Forces. The fate of the LRDG itself was poetic. The unit was designed for a singular task, to navigate the impassable ocean of sand in Libya and Egypt. When the North African campaign ended with Allied victory in 1943, the LRDG's ocean was gone. The war moved to the Rocky Mountains of Italy and the dense forests of the Balkans. The LRDG was deployed to these areas, performing valuable missions, but their magic advantage, the sun compass, the low-pressure tires, the sand navigation, was no longer relevant. The desert ship was in a different sea. The unit was officially disbanded in August 1945. But Bagnold's innovation was not the LRDG, it was the tactic. The LRDG itself may have died, but its DNA became immortal. It was inherited, in its entirety, by the unit the LRDG had made possible, the Special Air Service, SAS. David Stirling, the founder of the SAS, said it best, the LRDG were the masters of desert navigation, we in the SAS were merely the pupils. The LRDG was the brain, the SAS was the fist. The LRDG was the insertion platform, the SAS was the explosive charge. And when the post-war British Army was cutting units, the SAS, with its famous winged dagger emblem and, "Who dares, wins," motto, survived. And it absorbed the LRDG's ethos. Self-sufficiency, precision navigation, the ability to operate hundreds of kilometers from friendly lines, and the belief in small teams of highly skilled men, all of this was Bagnold's legacy, transferred to the SAS. Modern adoption, the Bagnold Principle. Today, Bagnold's moral of the story is standard doctrine for every special operations force in the world. The Desert Taxi, the LRDG SAS model, a specialized navigation/insertion unit carrying a specialized, direct-action unit, is now a pillar of special operations. The U.S. Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers, who fly modified Black Hawk helicopters to insert Delta Force or SEAL teams, are the direct, high-tech descendants of the LRDG's Chevrolet trucks. The Road Watch, the LRDG's intelligence mission, hiding 2 men in a hole for weeks to count tanks, evolved into modern long-range surveillance, LRS or LRSU, units. The truck hack, Bagnall's most visible innovation, is everywhere. Look at any modern Special Forces vehicle designed for the desert, the SEAL's Desert Patrol Vehicle, DPV, the British Supercat, Jackal, or the U.S. Army's M1297 GMV. What do you see? They are not tanks. They are light, fast, heavily armed vehicles, with the doors and roofs often removed. And most importantly, they all use wide, deep-tread, low-pressure tires. Bagnall's principle, flotation on sand, had won. The sun compass has been replaced by GPS, but the physics remain the same. Cultural memory and the moral of the story. The LRDG is memorialized in its insignia, a scorpion, the master of desert survival, framed by a truck wheel. While the SAS became world-famous, the LRDG remains the professional secret, the gentleman's unit that made the SAS fame possible. Their restored Chevrolet trucks sit in museums in the UK and New Zealand, monuments to a time when ingenuity beat brute force. The final moral of Ralph Bagnall's story is this: war is not won by generals or soldiers alone. It is won by innovators. In a conflict dominated by heavy tanks, rigid doctrine, and industrial might, the Battle of North Africa was broken by a middle-aged scientist who loved the desert enough to understand it. He proved that a knowledge of physics, garage-level ingenuity, and the courage to reject the standard solution were more valuable than a battalion of tanks. He did not conquer the desert, he used science to ask it for passage, and the desert let him pass.